Good afternoon, and thank you for joining me. I have been asked by Express Information Systems to provide you with an overview of a project tracking solution for Microsoft Dynamics GP clients. This product was developed by Encore Business Solutions and is a solution that will help companies organize and oversee multiple projects. Project tracking with advanced analytics integrates with all the core modules within Dynamics GP. So as you're entering your transactions in the general ledger, the bank reconciliation, sales order processing, inventory, invoicing, receivables management, purchase order processing, payables management, or the US payroll module, you can tag that transaction to one or more projects and capture any additional information that is required by you. Project tracking with advanced analytics is a great solution for an organization that has relatively simple project tracking requirements. They want to be able to simply capture the information at transaction entry and be able to run reports or inquire on the project profitability. I'm going to start by opening up the setup window, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the global settings. If I take a look at the top right-hand corner of the screen, we give you 7 transaction user-defined fields. You'll just define the titles here, and then you'll go on to create lists of values for each one of these fields. But these are another level of information that you're going to be able to capture against your project, and that will allow you to do some cross-project reporting as well. So in my environment, I'm actually doing some event tracking with my demo data, and I want to be able to track and report on the project manager, the location of my project, as well as the project type. Use for budgets will allow you to create multiple budgets for your project. So for example, if I had titled one of these fields phase and I marked the use for budgets checkbox, this would allow me at the time of creating my project budget to first of all select the project and then select the phase, create a budget for that phase, and then select the additional phases and create a budget for each. These checkboxes can be deselected at the project level. They're just globally, when you create your new project, they will default as marked. Constant value, when these checkboxes are marked, when I create my project, I will assign the value for each one of these. They will remain constant for the life of the project. So that means at the time of data entry, if the data entry clerk selects that project, the constant values will default in and they will be unable to change them. They'll be locked down. You can assign defaults and not mark them as constant, and the data entry person would then have the ability to override and change that value at transaction entry. Breakdowns are the feature that will allow you to maintain a streamlined chart of accounts, and they're typically based on the natural account segment within your chart of accounts. So if you think of something like maybe you have like graphic designer expenses, let's say, and you had multiple projects where you were expensing graphic design services, you would have typically a segment in your chart of accounts that would define the project, and then you would have multiple GL codes for graphic designer expenses, one for each project. With project tracking, you would be able to eliminate that one segment from your chart of accounts that defines the project and have one GL code for graphic design expenses. Within GP, you'll be able to run a report to see the total amount that was expensed to graphic design, and within project tracking, be able to break out exactly how much was expensed to each project for graphic design services. Disable cross-project budget reporting we'll talk about when we look at the budgeting component. The budgeting component is optional. When you install project tracking, you get the core project tracking with advanced analytics module. You also install the optional budgeting and the optional importer, and that functionality is opened up based on what you purchase and the keys that you obtain from Encore. So we'll talk about this feature when we look at the budgeting. You can also allocate a percentage of revenue, labor, and material cost to overhead. This is simply a report calculation, and I'll point it out when we run some reports. But the first column on your project P&L report will be your revenue, second column will be expenses, and the third column will be a calculation based on the percentage entered here. And then this is the global setting. When you create new projects, it will inherit this value, but you can override it if you want to assign a different overhead calculation based on project. We also piggyback on the functionality that GP provides through the revenue expense deferral module. So if you are using that module and you assign deferral at the transaction level, and then you assign that transaction to a project, we will allocate the project revenue or expense in the appropriate period. So we will piggyback on the the GP transactions as far as allocating the revenue or expense over future periods. There is security available for project tracking through the tasks and roles within the GP security setup, or you can further restrict security at the project level. So you might give some users access to project tracking, but maybe you just want to give them inquiry rights or the ability to just view information. Or you have other users where they have full rights, where they can create budgets and they can modify budgets. So you can restrict what a user can do in project tracking. You can also restrict which projects they can view and report on or assign transactions to. In addition to these 7 transaction user-defined fields, you also have access to 7 checkbox, 7 numeric, 7 date, as well as 20 text fields. And these are fields that you'll just assign field titles here. You'll see them when you create your projects. You can use them for storing additional information. They're available for pulling onto your reports, and they are also available in your smart list. So we have created the smart list objects for project tracking, so you have available to all of that information through your GP smart list. So that's everything in the setup window. Very few fields that need to be defined, your user-defined fields, and make sure your breakdowns are marked, and really those are the only settings that you really need to be concerned about to set up project tracking. The one nice thing about project tracking is that it's so flexible. If your requirements are really simple, you only want tracking expenses, you don't need to go as deep with your setups as another customer who's also tracking revenue. So you don't have to set up more than what you require. So once I've defined my setup window, we see those user-defined fields appear on my cards palette. I've come in and I've created lists for each one of my user-defined fields, and you can create an unlimited list of values. Your next step would be to create your breakdowns. Now, as I mentioned, breakdowns are your revenue and expense codes, typically based on the natural account segment within your chart of accounts. Now, having said that, some customers that are using project tracking have a project code or GL code for project revenue and a GL code for project expenses. And they are using those GL codes in their GP distribution window anytime the transaction is project related, and they're capturing all of the detail within project tracking. So that is an option. I have seen it done. It works well. It all depends on your particular business, and Express would be able to help you determine the best way to configure project tracking, as they have clients using it and they have experience with this module. So if you are a customer that has the need to track revenue as well as expenses, then you would be creating some breakdown codes for the amount types of sales. So let's just talk, first of all, what these amount types mean. They are directly related, first of all, to the type of transaction that you're entering in GP. So if you think of a sales transaction and the distribution, the GP distribution window, you will be capturing revenue for a sales transaction. You could potentially have trade discount on that transaction. You could have freight, miscellaneous charge, and sales tax. So if you want to assign all of those GP distributions to projects, then you would create breakdown codes for each of these. If you're not capturing revenue, you do not need to be concerned with these first. So sales, trade, freight, miscellaneous charge, sales tax are all related to revenue type transactions. So receivables, transaction entry, sales transaction entry could potentially be a journal entry that you're entering that you want to assign revenue to a project. So in my demo environment here, I've got a 50-50 raffle and ticket sales. That's how I want to be able to report on my project revenue. Estimated cost of labor, estimated cost of materials, those would be your cost of goods lines from sales type transactions. Now, labor and material, some customers are putting all of their project expenses under one, either labor or material, or they're breaking them out. You would break them out when you get to the point of running your reports. If you want to, you have a very these are labor type expenses and these are material type expenses, and you might want to split them out. But if you just want to see project expenses, you can put all of your expenses under either one or the other. It's really up to you. So I've entered in some different expense categories that I might have for labor. So again, probably related to your natural account segment and material. So that's really it for the background setup of setup project tracking. Define your setup window, define the lists for each one of your transaction user defined fields, and define your breakdowns. Now, some optional setups that I just want to go over, because when we enter transactions, you're going to see some of these pull in my environment. These are not required, but nice to have if you wish. You can set up vendor breakdowns. So in my example here, if I select this vendor at the time of transaction entry, so payables or purchase order processing, I am more than likely purchasing security services from this vendor. So by default, I'm going to select the project and this expense will default in for me. I can change it though because I've assigned some other options here as well. So security will default, but I might use them for painting or lighting or electrician. So that is an optional setup, again, not required, but nice to have if you wish to go that deep with your setups. Another not required setup, but those customers that have that one-to-one relationship between the GL code and the breakdown in project tracking, you can define a default. So in my example here, if this account exists in my GP distribution window, it's going to be ticket sales. So again, you can do that additional setup if you wish. That will make the data entry person's life just a little bit easier if you've gone there. Now, I just want to talk about a new feature that we are also in the process of adding that will be released relatively soon. It's going to be called mandatory distribution. And what it is going to be is a new window that will, when you refresh the window, will populate with all of your GL codes that you have set up in GP. And you will be able to define whether or not it's required that you're going to assign project information to it, always, never, or give the flexibility that sometimes it might be assigned to projects and others not. That was a request that came to us from a couple of customers recently, that if this code exists in my GP distribution window, it always needs to be assigned to a project. So that is a new feature that will be rolling out very soon. It'll be available for GP 2015, GP 2016, and GP 2018. Okay, so now all my background setup is done. Let's look at creating a project. When you open the project maintenance window, we see those field titles that I had defined in my setup window populate here, as well as the checkboxes are marked. I am going to select a project that I have already created, and we see here that I have populated my project manager, location, and project type. If we go click on the user-defined fields, we can see those titles and fields from the setup window, as well as the additional text fields. If I click on the cost button, this is going to give me just a quick snapshot of how this project is doing. I've done some estimating, so this was the estimated amount of sales. Here's the overhead calculation that populated from the setup window as well, so I could change this percentage if I wanted to. I've estimated my cost for this project, and this is the projected profit for this project. Now, as I enter transactions in GP and assign them to this project, this will update. So this is just a quick snapshot of how I'm doing. There's so many places in project tracking to report and inquire that we will look at some of those other options as well. Now, another optional feature is the ability to assign the breakdowns that are available for this project. So, you might be typically tracking one type of project, but then maybe you have an internal marketing project that you want to track, or maybe an internal office renovation, and those projects would have completely different breakdown codes than what you're typically using for your business. So you can, at the project level, define the breakdown codes that are going to be available for use for that project. And that also then restricts the list that it's going to be available for budgeting if you're budgeting for that project. So in this example, I'm not going to have a 50-50 raffle for this project. So I've restricted what is available for this particular project. Okay, so let's see how this all comes together. And I will recap it once I enter this transaction. So the process for assigning transactions to projects is the same throughout GP. You always start with your native GP transaction entry window. We have not modified it in any way. We do not change any of your current workflow and processes. So I'm going to enter in a payables invoice, as I always have in the native GP transaction entry windows. I'm going to select a travel company because that is my favorite vendor. Oh, let's make that $300. Okay, so I've entered in a $300 payables invoice. Now, if you're fully set up with GP and your distribution accounts are defaulting in for you, you may or may not need to go into the GP distribution window. So if you don't need to go into the distribution window, you can go right up here, additional and project distribution, which will then open the project tracking distribution window. Or if you need to go into the distribution window to adjust your distribution accounts, you would do that first. And that is another Encore product that I'm just minimizing. So this is the window that we trigger off of. Whatever exists in this window is what we are going to pull into the project tracking distribution window. So if I was going to have multiple expense accounts, then I would break out this distribution so that I had the multiple expense accounts. So once I'm satisfied that my distribution account is correct, then I can access project tracking from here as well, additional project distribution, or again, from the main window. And we pull in that expense line into our window. So I come into this window, we see this is the vendor that I had assigned the breakdown of security. I went and did that additional setup for my vendor breakdown, so it defaulted in for security. So I just need to pick the project that this transaction should be assigned to. My GL account is the GL account that exists in my distribution window. I do not have access to any other accounts. It must first exist in the GP distribution window. The amount is 300, that comes from my transaction, and all of the other fields have defaulted from my project setup. So I am done here. Now, if this was for 2 projects, I could change the amount here and add another line. And I would be able to do that. Now, if I had multiple distribution lines for different GL codes in the GP distribution window, when I opened this window, I would see those multiple distribution lines. And if they're all assigned to the same project, I can select the project here. It will populate all the lines, or I can go line by line and select the project. So you have the flexibility of assigning the project tracking distribution to multiple projects if that is the case. So this is the same window that opens in payables, purchase order processing, the general ledger, sales transaction entry. Once you know how to assign a transaction to projects in one module, it's the same throughout the system. Okay, let's take a look at a couple of reports and inquiries, and then we will talk about the optional add-on budgeting. So the project analysis report is your project P&L report, and I'm going to just bring up a couple of different options as far as how this report can be printed. Here I'm just going to look at a single project. If I marked it in detail, I would get all of the transaction information, but I just want a very summarized report. And we see here for my Dirks Bentley project, for the amount type of sales, so this is any transactions where I was capturing revenue, and here we have ticket sales, and any of my labor expenses, and my material expenses, and then that calculation for overhead. So my revenue less expenses and overhead expenses for a net profit or loss for this project. You can also put date restrictions on this report so that you're aware. Now I had location was one of my user-defined fields. So if I had multiple projects going on a particular location, or maybe I want to look at a particular project manager and all of the projects that he's managed over, or he or she has managed over the past year or the past 3 years, I could compare and contrast that project information by reporting based on one of those user-defined fields. So here I'm looking at the events that are going on at the MTS Center, and as I mentioned, like we've also got the date restriction as well. So we could put a GL posting date or document date into this report. So this is giving me the same summary information. So first of all, I have the Dirks Bentley project event was going on at that location. So I've got that project information. I also have an Eric Church concert going on at that location, and then a grand total for all projects, all events going on at that location, revenue less expenses. This report can also be run you can drill down to a selected breakdown type. Maybe you just want to look at your labor expenses, or drill right down into a single breakdown code with this report. Okay, let's look at the budgeting. So before I bring up a budget that I'd already created, this checkbox existed in the setup window and it was unmarked. So when I open up the project budget maintenance window, it also defaults as unmarked. And with it unmarked, you'll notice that the period duration is fiscal. Now this just means that the fiscal periods are going to be based on your company's fiscal period based on your fiscal setup in GP. No problem tracking projects across periods as well as years and even multiple years, because we track the information outside of the chart of accounts. It's just that your budget periods are going to be the same as your fiscal setup within GP. This also gives you the ability to do some cross-project budget reporting. If your period budgets are all based on the same period durations, then you can do a cross-project budget report. If I mark this checkbox, it will open up the period duration field where I can create project budgets based on different period durations. So if I had a 3-month project and I just wanted to create a single period budget, I could do so by marking this checkbox. Now I can have a combination of some based on fiscal and some not. It's just that if I wanted to do that cross-project budget report, the only projects that are going to pull in are the ones that are based on fiscal. So it really is just a preference. So I'm going to pull up my Dirks Bentley project here. There's many ways that you can populate the budgeted amount in this window. You can, put in a entered amount here, and you can increase or decrease based on the enter amount, and you can tell what period you want to start at, and then it'll increment or decrement based on the period, the base period. We also have an optional add-on importer, so that would allow you to create your project budget outside of GP and populate this window via an import. Once you've created the project budget, if it's approved, then if you import into that same budget again, it will create a new revision. So you may have multiple revisions. The importer is nice to use for that. The importer can be also used for a couple of other tasks as well. Like you can create your project master record via the import, and you can also get your beginning balances in via the import, and you can also bring in journal entries and have the project information attached to those journal entries as well. So project budgeting can be added on even after the fact. If you start off with the core module and decide down the road you want to do budgeting, you can purchase that additional add-on module and obtain the keys to open up the functionality. Any transactions for existing projects will be updated. The actuals will be updated with that information as well. So fairly straightforward. If you're doing it manually, we've got some filters in here so that you can just be working on a particular area of your budget. Let's look at the budget variance report. I'm just going to look at a single project here, and again, this one can be printed in so many different ways. I'm looking at the latest revision, either working or approved. You can select a period range. I want to look at period 5. I'm going to group it first of all by amount type and then by breakdown. The first 4 columns are based on my period selection in the report definition window, and those 4 columns are repeated with the life to date values. Okay, so this is for period 5, and I'm just going to scroll down so you can see the footer information here, and then repeated over to the right. So here we have actual amount for period 5, budget amount for period 5, variance amount for period 5, and variance percent for period 5. And then the 4 columns are repeated, and PTD means project to date values. We'll take a look at the inquiry window. Just look at one project here. Again, you can just be, if I didn't select a project, I could just look at AP vouchers if I wanted and see everything that's been signed. We've got, this is the GP assigned AP voucher number, but maybe you want to see your vendor document number. So from here, you've got your drill back. You can go right into the project tracking distribution, or you can go right back to the AP document, and from here you can also get back into the project tracking distribution. Also from this window, you can access our advanced analytics inquiry. Now this is very similar to if you have access to the SQL Query Analyzer, if you're querying the tables through the back end, but you're not going to cause any damage by running a query through the front end because we don't give you the ability to update or delete information here. So once you've built your query, you can export this information either to Excel, XML, HTML, or to a text file. You can save these queries as a favorite as well. I'm not going to put any restrictions in the header here. I'm just going to redisplay and it will return everything to me. If there's some information here that I'm not seeing that I would like to see, I can select our little column chooser by right-clicking and pull in additional fields. So there is my breakdown code. I want to put in my project type, or all of those easy to find fields are available to me. Now I can group this information by pulling my column headers up. So I'm grouping by project ID, and then maybe I want to group by transaction type. So this is just a very quick example of how you might use the query analyzer. You can save this information, as I mentioned. You can also export this information once these queries are built. And you also have the ability, again, to drill back to the transaction. And I guess the last piece that I want to show you would be the smart list. So I just want to show that we have all of the smart list objects that we ship with for project tracking available right from within GP Smart List. Now, we have several other ISVs that have added support for project tracking. RecLogic has, Paramount has added support for requisitions. MetaViewer has also added support. If you are using another ISV solution and you're contemplating adding project tracking, reach out to your account rep at Express Information and they can get you the information to see if it already has been added. We also have access to the SQL stored procedures for project tracking. So if you want to, if you're using Smart Connect or eConnect, and you want to, at the time of bringing transactions into GP, also bring in the project tracking information, the SQL stored procs are also available to you without any additional charge to help facilitate those integrations. So that concludes today's demonstration of Encore's project tracking with advanced analytics solution for Dynamics GP. I hope that I have demonstrated how flexible and easy to use this solution is. If you would like to learn more, please reach out to your account rep at Express Information Systems. And thank you for your time today.